Hey, good morning. This is Bob Enders with Top to Bottom. Today we're going to conduct a frame check and we're going to start from literally top to bottom. One note that most builders won't let you on their site without personal protection, which is your hard hat. So make sure you have your hard hat with you at all times. Let's get going. Okay, the four things that we want to check out on a frame check are: one, to make sure that the building is watertight. The second thing we're going to check is the structure of the building to make sure that the loads are transferred from the roof, around the windows, to the basement, all the way down. The third thing that we're going to check is for cosmetic things like straight corners in bathtubs and counters, and we're also going to be checking for safety items. We always like to start top to bottom because that's where the load starts. It starts at the top and it goes from top all the way to the foundation. We want to make sure that load is transferred around the windows and the doors and to the first floor and all the way to the basement. Some of the tools that you're going to need to do a frame check, other than your typical inspection tools like your camera and your flashlight, is you're going to need a nice level. I've scared many carpenters away back in their truck with this nice 8-foot level. It's good for checking bowed studs. And the other tool you're also going to need is a good framing square. This allows you to check the squareness of corners around bathtubs, counters, and stud walls. I always like to start off by walking the house and looking for the dirtiest roof truss. Dirtiest roof truss? Why? Well, if you've ever seen roof trusses being delivered, it's kind of comical. They come in a big truck and they get rolled off into the mud, into the dirt. And in this particular house, that roof truss right there is my dirtiest one. That's the one I'm going to inspect first. I'm looking for broken webs. And in this particular house, I do have a broken web over back in there that I had to get a repair detail on. So once I've identified that all the roof trusses are intact and or not broken or broken, we're going to identify that. Starting off with the structure, we want to make sure that our roof load is transferred from the roof around windows and doors, and this is called a header. The header is held up by a jack and a stud. This is the bearing point that we're going to trace all the way to the basement. Okay, so we've identified and inspected any roof trusses that may be broken. Now we're going to talk about the structure of the roof itself. All right, this member right here is called a girder truss. A girder truss is holding up our main roof trusses. You usually find this typically at a reverse gable in the front of the house. It's very important that all the hanger nails are installed, and we also want to look at the nailing pattern of the girder truss. You don't necessarily need the engineered drawings to know that if it's nailed or not nailed. If it's sparsely nailed, then I would call it out. You're typically looking for a row of 3 nails every 8 to 12 inches, and that is a properly nailed girder. What we're trying to do is we're trying to take 2 pieces and make it as one to help support the whole roof. Now the weight of the girder truss gets transferred over to this side wall, and we have solid blocking which also goes all the way down, and we're going to check that when we get to the next level. The other thing we want to check on the roof trusses is to make sure that the hurricane straps are installed and nailed properly. Okay, so once we've identified the bearing points of the particular room, we want to keep a mental note of that because that's what we're going to be checking when we get to the basement. Other things that we want to check for as we go from room to room is we want to check for the wire spacing. We want to make sure that the wires are directly in the middle of the stud. That prevents a drywall nail from piercing the wire. These little devices make it real simple. You can't screw that up. You can just nail that right to the wall and hook your wires into it, and it gives you the proper spacing. So the other thing we want to look at as we look at wires, is we want to make sure that where a wire penetrates from one floor to the next floor, that it's fire stopped properly. Fire stopping actually slows the fire down and doesn't give it a direct path to go from one floor to the next floor. So anytime you see a penetration from one floor to the next, you want to make sure that it's fire stopped properly. Where these things aren't feasible to use, you want to make sure that there's nail plates. So again, a drywall nail won't pierce the wire. So just before leaving a room, I always like to check for bowed studs. Very simple. If you have a nice 8-foot level, just put it across. If you see one that's kind of out of whack, you can check it this way as well. All right, just got a little bit of a bow in it. What I like to do is, I'm on somebody else's property, I'll make an X like that. Take a picture of it and note it in the report. The bowed stud with the X is the one that I'd like to have repaired. All right, the next thing I like to check before leaving your room is I spot check the outlets and switch boxes. A lot of people don't realize that this is the only time that the electrical inspector has a chance to see these wires in this condition. The next time he'll be back, they'll have switches and plate covers on them. He'll never be able to inspect them. Some of the things he looks for is to see if the grounds are properly tied in, that there's not too many wires in the box. And lastly, believe it or not, is when the electrician cuts off the outer sheathing, he usually uses a razor knife, and if he's not good enough, he'll nick the conductors in here. And I always like to spot check a few of those. If you just look inside the box, make sure none of the wires are nicked. Always stuff them back in too, because they get mad if you don't. So just spot check a few. If you happen to find a lot of nicked wires, I would bring that to the attention. One of the most important boxes to check would be the 220 dryer plug. Not only is it high voltage, but it's a very thick wire, and it's very hard for them to strip it. So you want to look inside, make sure the conductors aren't nicked, and check that. That looks good. Stuff the wire back in. Okay, one of the areas that we want to check for cosmetics is where a countertop will be. Caulk can only do so much in the finish end, so you want to check, make sure that your corners are nice and square. That way they don't have to use excessive caulk in the end. Another critical area to check for cosmetics is inside a bathtub or shower. You want to make sure that the corners again are nice and square. Ceramic tile is pretty unforgiving. Once you put it on the wall, you can see a variation from a 1/2 inch all the way up to a 3/4 inch, and it doesn't look very nice. Okay, we've gone from room to room up here, and we've checked for our bearing points, we've checked for our fire stopping, we've checked for bowed studs, checked the corners of our bathtubs and sinks. Now it's time to head downstairs and follow the bearing points to the next level. Come on down. All right, so we come down to the next floor and we check to see if our blocking is in from our girder truss above all the way to the basement. And then over here, we also have now the second floor bearing on the first floor with the roof trusses. So here's our blocking for our window header above. So it's resting on this header, which again, jack stud all the way to the basement. All right, another important aspect of frame check is the floor system framing. Everyone will be getting a floor chart, a hole chart today with their packet. We want to specifically look at the holes and the space from the end of the truss to the hole and the size of the pipe. Different manufacturers have different rules, but for the most part, what I'm giving you today should get you by. So you always want to make sure that you don't have a hole too close to the sweet spot, which is the first about 1.5 feet here, so you don't want any holes there. You want to make sure that your joist hangers are nailed properly, and in this case we even added some glue on the bottom just to make it a little bit more sturdy. So you take a quick look at your floor joists all over the place, make sure your holes are fine. Sometimes there's squash blocks required on a bearing wall that may be upstairs, but most of our upstairs walls for this purpose are on the exterior walls, and there's no bearing walls in the middle. Okay, as with upstairs, we've gone from room to room. We've checked our bowed studs, we've checked our wires in the box, and we've checked our bearing points. A couple of times we have to scoot back and forth just to make sure that we're catching all the bearing points. We've checked our floor system framing. Now it's time to go out into the garage. Okay, so here we are in the garage. Some of the things that we're going to be able to see out here are our sill plate bolts here and here. You want to make sure that they're bolted in the corners and every 6 feet along that wall over there. The other thing that we want to look for is to make sure our column is bolted securely to the foundation and that it is welded at the top at the beam. Another thing we want to check in the garage, because it is an unconditioned area, is to make sure that our sheathing seams are all properly taped for air infiltration. If we have living space above us, we want to make sure that the floor system framing is properly insulated. Okay, so we've made it through the first floor, checking all our bearing points. Now we're in the basement. This is the end point. We want to be making sure that we're following our bearing points all the way to the foundation. This is where the structure ends, right here at the foundation. We want to check to make sure that our beams are welded. A lot of times when you get to this point, your water heater and your furnace are not functional, they're not hooked up, the gas is still disconnected from the units, but you can inspect the flues visibly and make sure that they're in place before they go ahead and sheetrock. You could also check the electrical panel grounding at this point, but for the most part the systems aren't operational. Typically this is all you're going to see at this stage in production for the electrical panel is one breaker. It's called a temporary pending final that allows me to get my electrical meter on the house. In a basement, this is the typical lighting that you're seeing. It's good to have a good flashlight. You get into areas like this where there's no lights, no windows, very difficult to see, so carry a good flashlight. So we'll conduct our basement framing inspection, chasing our bearing points and checking our fire stopping, and we'll conclude on the outside of the house. Okay, so now we're on the outside of the home. A few things we want to check on the outside is, like in the garage, that all our seams on our sheathing are taped and that our windows are properly flashed. Got the header flashing, the side flashing, no flashing on the bottom flange, but you have to have your sill flashing here. You want to make sure all your outside penetrations are sealed, like this one is not, so this will be noted on your report. Okay, so that concludes the framing inspection for this house. You notice that we've done it from top to bottom and ended up on the outside. It's a condensed version. If we were to do it room by room, component by component, it would have taken about an hour and a half to do, but this just gives you the gist of what we want to get accomplished on a frame check. Thank you. Are we rolling? All right, so first thing in the frame check that we're going to do, I don't like that at all. All right, good morning. Today, let's cut that, edit that out. I'm not an actor. I'm cold.
All right, so put your hard hat on. If we can get that alarm to stop, that'd be great.
So once you get the video, you can cut that out. Go go through the whole house and you'll see where that ends up. And I don't like that part either. You're gonna have a lot of editing to do, okay? Wow, my fingers are numb. In a typical house, can I back up? I gotta back up. A nice framing square. Framing square allows you to check into corners, make... I'm not an actor.
Are you done?
Yeah, I'm done.